Friday, Baylor College of Medicine and Friends of Baylor. Well, it's finally 2025. I've made a lot of New Year's resolutions, none of which I'm going to share with you. But Lily has also had several New Year's resolutions, including to cut down on her wardrobe expense. But of course, she's already bought 2 new sweaters and she's got her jersey on for the Texas game, so whatever. Anyway. Oh, and many of you asked about this painting. This painting is by Albert Schuback, who's a Swiss painter. I like it too. And many of you have commented. So, of course, what's the most important thing in news is bird flu is raging all over the place. There was a case in Louisiana, the first death in the United States of a person died from bird flu. She was over 65, had other medical problems. Interestingly enough, she had birds in her backyard, and that was presumably the exposure was to wild birds. And that is not, the virus that infected her is not the same virus that is infecting cattle, but it is the one in wild birds. So the concern is when they sequence the virus, there are a few changes in it that make it more able to bind to human cells. So there's no evidence that it's going from person to person, but it has mutated to actually get into human cells more easily. So that's a real problem. Remember, we talked about the teenager in Canada who also was infected. She got extremely ill. She showed up on November 4th, a 13-year-old. It showed up in the emergency room in British Columbia with a 2-day history of conjunctivitis, which is what sort of the people who had been working with dairy cattle have been getting conjunctivitis and then upper respiratory symptoms. They discharged her. 3 days later, she showed up with more serious illness, coughing, vomiting, GI symptoms, and then developed respiratory distress. She was admitted to the pediatric intensive care unit. She tested positive for H5N1 and had a really, really tough course. She was on what's called ECMO. They were artificially oxygenating her blood. But she has recovered, and so she seems to be getting over it. Those are the 2 major cases that have been seriously ill. But it's extremely widespread in wild birds. It's obviously very widespread in the dairy industry. And so far, there have been 66 cases in humans, 36 related to dairy cattle, the rest of them mostly to poultry farm workers. But it's been devastating to the animal world. There's over 11,000 wild birds that's been detected in, 129 million, almost 130 million poultry, and 915 dairy cattle. And if you look at where the most cases have been, most of them in California and dairy, in the dairy world, dairy farmers, then Washington and Colorado. So what are they suggesting? The CDC is suggesting that if you work with poultry or you work in the dairy industry and are exposed to animals, you should be basically wearing protective clothing. So PPE, just like it was back with COVID, very highly protective gear, including goggles, masks, and respirators and gloves, etc. And of course, what the big concern is, will it spread to humans and start having human-human transmission? And there's sort of 2 ways this could happen. The first way is it could get into other animals, like we see it in poultry, but mostly in the bigger concern is in dairy cattle, or cats seem to be a reservoir. Lily is not real happy about that, but cats have been getting infected, usually probably exposure by eating or hunting wild birds or eating animals that have been infected. So the virus in another host could be evolving and could eventually develop mutations that are enough to jump into humans. That's a concern. That is what happened, for example, with swine flu. It was in pigs and jumped to humans. And so far, there have been a number of animals that are known to be infected. It's not domestic cats in particular, horses. There have been, in Mongolia, there are horses that are positive antibodies to H5N1, so they've clearly been infected. And in Arizona, a cheetah, a mountain lion, a swamp hen, a Canada goose, and a kookaburra have all been infected and died from H5N1. So clearly it is able to get in these other animal reservoirs, and the concern is it will mutate and be able to jump into man. Probably even more concerning is that if a person who's infected with influenza sort of the usual influenza, and H5N1, that there could be a recombination event that would then make it very easy to travel between people. So what is the likelihood? It's pretty likely, actually. There's 10,000 dairy workers, for example. The usual number of people who get infected with seasonal influenza is about 20%. So there are likely to be 2,000 dairy workers who are also infected with influenza. What percentage of those might get infected by H5N1? Well, all it takes is 1 or 2. So I think there's a reasonable chance that a person with influenza, seasonal influenza, who works in either dairy or poultry industry will also be infected with H5N1, and that is the real concern. It doesn't mean that it will automatically happen, that there'll be a recombination event, but that is what the big concern is. Now, if you're in the dairy industry or working with chickens, hopefully you've gotten your seasonal flu vaccine. That's really important. That'll help mitigate that concern. But anyone who's dealing with it, whether you have backyard chickens, you should be really seriously considering wearing PPE when you're out there working with the chickens. The rest of us just sort of use common sense. Don't pick up dead animals. Don't let your pets go get dead animals. Now, when I'm walking down the street with Lily and there's a squirrel that's dead, she loves to go get it. You have to actually be very vigilant to make sure that your pets aren't getting involved with dead animals or birds. Anyway, that's the best we can do, and we'll see. But it's getting to be a major concern, and I think hopefully that we have vaccine production taking place. I think the FDA is getting ready to approve a bunch of different vaccines, but we need to be ready because I think there's more than a reasonable chance that we'll have an outbreak of H5N1. Now, there's also been an outbreak of human metapneumovirus in China. Now, human metapneumovirus was discovered in 2001. It's part of the RSV family of viruses, but it's been probably circulating in man for over 60 years. It's a seasonal virus, begins in the winter, ends in the spring. Most people have long-term protection against this virus, and so it's pretty serious when you first get it, and most kids under the age of 5 will first get exposed to this virus, and so they get pretty sick. So it's a fairly common problem for pediatric practices and pediatric hospitals. Most adults, since they've already been exposed to it, don't have a very serious illness, but it can be if you're over the age of 65. Everything's bad if you're over the age of 65. I'm just quitting. Anyway, give up. Anyway, we're in the middle of seasonal respiratory virus. They're all beginning to peak. These are all cases of respiratory viruses, but you can see flu's on the rise, RSV, and COVID's beginning to pick up again. Nationally, influenza test positivity increased last week to 18.7%, RSV to 12.8%, and COVID to 7.1%. So far, there's been 5.3 million cases of influenza, 63,000 hospitalizations, and 2,700 deaths, including at least 11 children. So it's been a pretty typical and serious flu season. You can see this was last year, and this is this year. We're beginning to peak right before the end of the year, mid-December, which is sort of the classic time. The good news is it's almost all influenza A. The yellow is influenza A, the green is influenza B. And of the influenza A, mostly it's H3N1 and H1N1. Those are what's in the flu vaccine. So if you've gotten your flu vaccine, you're very well protected. Even if you get it, it'll be less serious. So if you haven't gotten it, it's kind of late, but if you haven't gotten it, you should get it. And this is a map of the number of the activity, extremely high in Louisiana, Texas. You can see all throughout the South and the West Coast, a lot of influenza activity. And this influenza season seems to be just like the influenza season that was right before the pandemic. So this is various years where you see the peaks. The red circles are this year, and we are tracking along that green line, which was exactly the 2019-2020 season. And I did this thing, just looked at the peak of activity. It happened in between the 50th and 52nd week of the year, which is, last week. And this season, that was last season, this season, exactly the same time, the 50th to 52nd week. Now, COVID, It's hard to believe we had a pandemic 5 years ago. I'm still getting over it. It seemed like I lost 2 years of my life doing that stupid pandemic. But it's back. It's beginning to come back up in all age groups. If you look at number of hospitalizations, it's beginning to increase for COVID. So, it's back along with RSV and everything else. So, as you know, we have the Texas Epidemic Public Health Institute, or TEPI, looks at wastewater for 80% of Texans and can actually, in a non-biased way, see what viruses are increasing. And you can see it's a lot. It's the usual typical respiratory viruses. Influenza A is rising, parainfluenza is increasing, RSV-A, parvo-19, and you can begin to see SARS. It's not at its high peak, but it's beginning to trickle up. Interestingly enough, there's a huge spike in norovirus. Now, what is norovirus? Norovirus is that stuff that you get on cruise ships, which is why I will never get on a cruise ship. Because once you get, all it takes is one person. One person who's infected infects the whole thing. So it is the most common cause of vomiting and diarrhea and foodborne illnesses in the United States. New strains are developing all the time, which is one of the reasons why it's hard to develop long-term immunity. But it has reached its highest level in more than a decade. So for some reason, there's a huge amount of norovirus. We've had 91 outbreaks this year alone compared to 65 last year. And it causes 900 deaths annually, 109,000 hospitalizations, and somewhere between 19 to 20 million people infected. It is transferred through contaminated food or fomites. It's one of those viruses that can stay on surfaces for 2 hours. All you have to do is touch it, and then you bring it up, to your face or mouth, and you get it. And so this is why you get on a ship with a few thousand people, and all it takes is one person to be contaminated, and then they touch things, and you touch it, and next thing you know, the entire boat's infected. Anyway, it's a horrible disease. We have, Mary Estes is one of the great experts, and just had an article, actually, in, what was it, the Atlantic? What was it? Atlantic, I think? It was an article about Mary, in reference Mary Estes' work. The biggest problem, it's hard to grow norovirus, so her laboratory has figured out ways to grow little organoids that are like a little small gastrointestinal sac in culture, and she can grow norovirus, and so hopefully we'll develop a vaccine for norovirus. That would be awesome. So I want to end today with a bunch of shout-outs. First of all, congratulations to 10 Baylor faculty members that were selected as the 2024 most highly cited researchers by Web of Science. This recognizes scholars whose publications are in the top 1% of their field. It's a wonderful recognition of the outstanding research that's conducted by our faculty. I just want to briefly mention them. Dr. Ajami, Dr. Ballantyne, Mavaskar, Hashim El-Sarraj, Dr. Gibbs, Dr. Jankovic, Dr. Sanjay, Petrosino, and Versalovic, and Bing Zhang. All congratulations. That's quite an honor to be in the top 1% of your field. Also, I want a big shout out to Dr. Arindam Sarkar, Assistant Professor of Family and Community Medicine, who received the Texas Academy of Family Physicians' inaugural Rising Star Award. He was presented the award at the annual session of their meeting, and congratulations to him. And finally, of course, we're all excited about the Texans making it into the playoffs. My favorite player, obviously Nico Collins, because he's the University of Michigan graduate. Unfortunately, we're going to play against the Chargers, and they have Jim Harbaugh as their coach, so we'll see. But we're rooting for the Texans. Anyway, have a wonderful weekend, and I can't wait to see you next week.